All right. Well, good to, have everybody here. Very exciting to join my first digital Olympus. I think it's been a really great resource listening to some of the talks so far, which has been awesome. So today I wanted to talk to you guys about something near and dear to my heart, even though, by trade, I'm a marketer like I think many of us. On the side, I've really had to work hard to develop my management and team building skills. And I think that's a situation that a lot of us as marketers find ourselves in. On the one hand, we have our, creative or analytical skills that we put to use every day. But as we, become more successful, we drive more traffic, and we start to build out our organizations, we are tasked with these very different requirements, and we try to build out our teams, and that can be so exciting, but it can also be a real struggle. So having worked on digital teams that are as small as really just me, and considering that to be a team, to teams that are over 70 just in the digital marketing space, I've noticed that there are some real challenges that we can have as we're building out the team. One of my previous roles, we went from being 20 people when I was first hired to over 70 in just 1 year. So some real potential for growing pains, but also some real opportunities for us as marketers to scale very effectively. All right, so let's jump in. So when we think about setting up our culture to scale, we're really thinking about how can we improve our team outputs. And there are three real ways that we can improve those outputs. There's capabilities, so we can add in team members who have different capabilities, and we can expand the scope of what we do as marketers. So if you're an in-house team, you're able to pull more of that work in-house, market on different channels, do different things. And if you're an agency, you get to expand your service offerings. Maybe work with fewer freelancers, etc. So expanding our capabilities is one goal that we have when we're scaling our team. We're also looking to scale up our capacity and improve the volume of work that we're doing. Not just by getting more bodies in there, but also by developing some economies of scale and really being able to standardize our processes and work more efficiently. And then finally, we're also looking to, keep our culture, at least the key parts that really make us unique as an organization, and also adapting as we bring in new talent with new ideas. So those are kind of the three main areas that we're thinking about when we're thinking about what we want to accomplish when we scale up our teams. When it's actually time to scale up, it can be really easy to get caught up in the excitement and not think about what the end goal for the business is. So, we're really excited to get new team members, get new thoughts and ideas, but we don't always think about, what is the long-term goal of adding to the team. So, I found that these three areas are really critical to think about as you're starting to scale up, whether you're going from 1 to 2, or from 2 to 20, or from 20 to 100. So when we're thinking about scaling up, we're also thinking about how mature our existing team is. So we might be starting with a relatively immature team, which is, not to say anything bad, but just a relatively new team, one where the culture isn't as fully formed. Or we could be going from a mature team and then bringing on new people. We really think about it as a whole new team. So, going back to that more immature state. And those three aspects that we talked about previously are really critical to evaluating our team's maturity. So thinking about culture, which is really how your team works. And I think that's going to be the primary focus of what we're talking about today, but also the capabilities, or what types of work your team can produce, and your capacity, which is how much work your team can produce. So, the higher you rank or the stronger you are in each of these three areas, the more mature your team actually is. So, there are multiple types of teams as we identify our team's maturity. There is the small but scrappy team, which is very familiar to many of us, especially anyone who's freelanced or, started their own business. Starting small but scrappy is very common. That has your backbiting team, which is a little less healthy. the Million Pass the Buck team, and the Revisionary Team. So the Small but Scrappy team has a very unique process. And thinking about it in terms of the agency model, even if that's not you, thinking of it in a very project-based way, we start off with the project kickoff. And then we find that increasingly, no matter how good our estimates are, we find that we're routinely under-resourced. So oftentimes we just think we don't have enough heads, we don't have enough bodies to get the actual work done on the timeline that we've provided. And even teams that have already experienced this kind of cycle before can often fall into this trap. It results in missed deadlines or project overruns, and it really can cause problems. So the Small but Scrappy team faces some issues, both with oftentimes being more immature, specifically in the way of capabilities and capacity. The development there is often a little bit slower. So, gaining those you can gain new capabilities and you can get more capacity, but you have to work extremely hard to get there, just as a facet of having fewer people on the team. There's also the Has Your Backbiting team, which we often see as teams are starting to scale up from those smaller and scrappier teams. As you introduce new people, you're introducing new capabilities, you're introducing more capacity, but the culture is very much in flux as you're adding these people, adding these team members. And if you're not careful, it can be very easy for a lot of distrust to seep in. And that really is problematic if you're trying to build a strong culture. So it often starts out with a good period of team building, but can quickly devolve into gossip, retaliation, and start a really unhealthy cycle. And it's not so much about the work to be done, but more about how the work gets done. So that's another common trap that teams can fall into as they're starting to scale. And we see this more with teams that are scaling more recently, or going from very small to even mid-size, 10, 20. These growing pains can happen. There's also the Revisionary Team. And once the team is, more settled in, the culture is more solidified, this would be probably a more mature team and likely mature in not just the area of culture, but also in, its capabilities and its capacity as well. So oftentimes the projects start with an idea, they go through an approval process, and edits are made. But there's no off-ramp because we have a strong culture. Everybody is able to weigh in and provide their opinion. But of course, no two people see the world exactly the same. So it's easy to get stuck into a collaborative yet not effective way of doing work. And I think the central theme for this one is just one more round of revisions. I think if you've worked at an agency, oftentimes you've seen this coming from the client teams. But even in, within the agency itself, we can see this pattern occurring. We definitely see it with in-house teams as well. There's also the Million Pass the Buck team. Again, this is something that we see with a more mature team where it has a very defined culture. Sometimes it might even devolve into an us versus them way of thinking, which can be problematic. On the one hand, it's great that the culture is so defined and the team identifies with itself so strongly. And having that cohesive team identity is great, but it can also, make it difficult for those team members to relate to and communicate with people outside the team. So if you're at an agency, maybe certain clients, you might have problems interacting with them. If you are an in-house team, maybe some of those adjacent teams, maybe if you're on a digital marketing team, there are other traditional marketing teams that you work with and can potentially collaborate with. PR or IT are very common groups that you might be working alongside. So for these teams, it can be a little hard to work nicely within the broader organization. So some of the pitfalls that we see here are that on a project scale, we start with, again, another great idea, but then where we start to lose traction is during the assignment. So in a place where people don't have clearly defined roles, it can really become problematic. So when you have multiple people who might have the same capabilities or similar capabilities, and multiple people that have some capacity, questions can remain who is responsible for what. So that can really be tricky for teams that are scaling. This, again, often leads to, edits and people, not really sure who's the final decision maker, who's going to do the final work. So I think one of the key themes here would be to say, let's toss that to another team. So the root of the problem here for teams that are scaling, whether you're scaling from 1 to 2 or 2 to 10, or far beyond that to a 100+ person marketing organization, the root of the problem isn't what is done, but why it's done that way. And this really comes back to company culture and more specifically your team culture. So the root of the problem is why work is done in that way. So the question is, as you're scaling your team, how do you work to keep your company culture? There are quite a few ways that you can do this. You can perform a culture audit, prioritize aspects of your culture, record the most important aspects of your culture, retain your culture, and revisit your culture. So we can perform a culture audit. Harvard Business Review has some really great free resources to subscribers that can provide really helpful templates. You can also search online. There are a lot of frameworks out there. There might be one that's perfect for you. From looking at quite a few different resources, I found that most of them center around 3 key themes. So first of all, we look at who actually communicates. So does the marketing leader communicate with the intern and the people who are low on the totem pole? Who communicates with people outside the group? Really thinking about what are all those communication patterns that happen. We also want to look at how we communicate. So are we communicating via email? Are we using asynchronous communication? Are we using face-to-face meetings? What are the expectations for how quickly we get back to one another? Really defining how we communicate with one another and to a broader extent with people outside the group. And finally, how are the capabilities and capacity determined? So really, who's responsible for setting KPIs? Who sets the benchmarks? And you'll notice that none of these explicitly ask about what your culture is like. And there's not much about, what values you have. And I think that's very intentional that those aren't the common thread, because we're really looking, when we're doing a culture audit, not at what has been made overt. So maybe your mission statement or your values as a team, but really looking for those more covert messages and how is work actually done, not just what we, want to strive to achieve, but we're trying to get a pulse on how we're actually performing. Once you've performed the culture audit, you've probably come up with quite a few aspects of your culture. And it might be an overwhelming amount, or it might be just a few key items. But in either case, you'll want to take those common threads and you'll want to prioritize them. So as you're prioritizing them, some useful questions to ask yourself. Number one, what answers in the audit were generally agreed upon? So you'll want to see what's been a common thread as your team members have been, filling out these surveys, or in interviews that you've done, or even just from observing your surroundings as you work. Second, what would fundamentally change if we did it differently? So this is really key to defining what is going to be most important, not just what everybody agrees on or what everybody understands, because that does, give you a broad base, but more specifically, what is most critical to your organization is to understand what would actually move the needle if you were to change it. And finally, you want to ask yourself, should we be doing things differently? Are there parts of your culture that aren't as functional? Maybe they're even dysfunctional. Are there parts of your culture that you can let go and that could be improved upon? And that really frees you up to focus on what your core aspects of the culture are. If there are specific ways that you do things that really set you apart and are foundational to your organization, those are critical for you to identify. Finally, you're going to want to record your culture. And we'll really think of this as the end of the culture audit. You'll want to determine what will be overt and covert. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but we understand that in any culture, there are going to be overt aspects, what we, say we're striving towards, what we say we value, how we say we want to do things. But there are also covert messages as well. And these covert messages are really going to be more embedded into your processes and your ways of doing things. So for example, if part of your company culture is work hard, play hard, I think a lot of the agency people who are streaming right now can probably relate. You can say that overtly, but some of those covert messages might include, say, having a Friday fun day or a Friday fun lunch where the team gets together and really lets go of work for an hour or so. So while it's not overtly saying we work hard, we play hard, it is, I think, contributing to that message. So when you're choosing what's going to be overt and covert, you are going to want to choose a format that's true to your organization. So for example, Friday Fun Day, mandatory fun with your office mates isn't going to be true to everyone. Definitely works really well for some people. Other people, that's just not their culture. As you're making, this document and you want to have that overt message, maybe you put it on your company website, maybe you just disseminate it internally, maybe you just put it on a whiteboard and it's something that's very transient and not permanent seeming. It's really whatever works best for you and is truest to your team. But I do encourage you to find a place that's universally accessible to maintain your record. So whatever you put down, whatever you write down, whatever you codify and make overt, I definitely encourage you to put it in a place where everyone can access it. I think that's really critical. So post-audit, what can you actually do to, keep your company culture, as you're scaling up your marketing team? So number one, I recommend that we find policies, events, and ways of working that align with the overt aspects of your culture. So we have, what we've written down and what we've, made official, but there are, lots of unofficial ways that we can spread that message throughout our marketing team. And also encourage members to live out and contribute to the culture in their own ways, especially as you bring on new members to your team. They'll have very different interpretations of your company culture. Not wrong, not, working against the culture, but just different ways of living that out. And we really need to encourage that as marketers. It can be very easy to hire for culture fit and, get into a groupthink state of mind. But that's really detrimental to our teams. We really need to focus not so much on making sure that everybody absorbs the message and acts in a single unified way, but rather that they see and absorb that message and, apply their own interpretation to it. And finally, you'll want to revisit your culture, especially if you're scaling quickly. Number one, do not take your culture for granted. Assuming that just because you've made some efforts to, codify it, to make it overt, and also to kind of disseminate that message throughout your organization does not mean that it is not going to change. Reassess your audit in short form, either annually or as you grow. For most teams, annually is more than enough, but for teams that are scaling very, very rapidly. So really, if you're doubling the team, you might want to revisit this. And it's really important because as people come and go, there might be aspects of your culture that you once thought were absolutely critical to your core as a marketing team, but it may turn out that it's not as crucial as you once thought. And continue to ask for overt feedback about your culture. As you do the culture audit, you'll probably perform interviews or send out forms to the different team members. And I'd encourage you to continue to do this. You want to keep asking for feedback. You don't want to remain stagnant. Recognizing the culture as a living, breathing thing is really crucial as you're scaling. All right. Well, thank you guys very much. I think we have enough time to do a few questions.